Rory Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, very much. Very aware that the number one obligation in my new role in the Defence Committee is to sit down quickly to let other people speak, who know a great deal more about the subject than I do. So I'm going to touch very rapidly on a sense of what the Defence Committee has been working on for the last 15 years directly related to this subject of defence spending. The central argument, and I've had a happy time for the last 3-4 weeks going through an enormous number of such documents, which, as you can imagine, now fill almost an entire room over the last 15 years. But the central theme in everything the Defence Committee has done is to argue that the question of defence spending should be determined above all by our assessment of the threats we face and the strategy we have to deal with them. That it is simply not good enough to base a defence strategy or defence spending on what we happen to have spent in the past or what kit we happen to have had in the past, which we wish to replace. And the Defence Committee has identified over the last 15 years 3 types of threat. State-on-state threat, threats from humanitarian catastrophes, and threats from terrorists. And today, in 2014, we meet all of these threats simultaneously, in some cases in a more extreme and more aggressive form than we've ever seen them before. Firstly, state-on-state threat, Russia. This is the 2008 report of the Defence Committee, which the honourable member sitting opposite, right honourable member sitting opposite, participated on as a member of the committee. Russia, a new confrontation. Russia, as the honourable member has just pointed out, Putin's actions in Crimea suggest a very, very dangerous type of threat that the Defence Committee was beginning to point to in 2008 and has finally come to fruition. It is a threat proved in Crimea of Putin's ability to deploy unconventional measures almost without a shot fired. This is traditional Spetsnaz GRU activity where he's able to annex part of a neighbouring state without the deployment of full conventional forces. Second type of threat is, of course, represented by the exercises last year, which we call the Zapad 2013 exercises, suggesting that Russia is practicing an airborne invasion of the Baltic and is able to follow this up with a maritime blockade and the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons. Second type of threat, Syria. We can see again the humanitarian intervention at its most extreme challenge in Syria. 150,000 people killed, millions of refugees generated. Thirdly, terrorism. In Western Iraq now, we face almost the sum of all the fears of the last decade. We have there exactly what the global war on terror was supposed to solve forever. An entire territory controlled by a jihadist group, now in control in Mosul of a city of 2 million people, and representing, unfortunately, a real challenge to the West. Question then posed to us, what can we, Britain and our allies, do, and what additional resources would we require to deal with those 3 threats? Look at it on the surface, the picture is pretty depressing. It does not seem, looking at it directly, as though there is much that Putin would be worried about if he was contemplating chewing off a corner of Latvia. And we need to be quite clear about the decline in our capacity and planning over the last 20 years. We've not been exercising for this phenomenon, we've not designed troops for this phenomenon, and if you are, for example, the kind of man who likes to go fishing with his shirt off, it might well be tempting to try to humiliate NATO. Unlikely. 0.1% chance, 1% chance, doesn't matter how unlikely it is, but the question is, are we ready to meet it? Do we have the kinds of plans in place to make that Article 5 defence credible? And in particular, when we talk about tripwires, do we have a population prepared to use nuclear weapons to support a NATO member state? On humanitarian intervention in Syria, of course, the entire debate within this House showed the problems of us responding to that kind of situation. And on the subject of terrorism, the failure, ultimately, 4 years later, of the deployment of over 100,000 American troops and $120 billion a year of expenditure to achieve a lasting settlement to the Sunni insurgency in Western Iraq suggests that we're going to face a very considerable problem doing it again. On the basis of my very, very early superficial reading of what the Defence Committee has been saying for the last 15 years, I would suggest, however, the answer ultimately is more hopeful. What the Defence Committee has argued again and again is that to answer these kinds of questions, we need to begin fundamentally with strategy. That means that we as a country need, bluntly, to get more serious. We need to invest far more in our thinking capacity. We need to rebuild a hollowed-out DIS. We need to rebuild the questions, the hard questions which were regularly asked in NATO planning meetings throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. We need to focus on where we've got it wrong. If we're to win the public back again, if we're to win back public confidence in intervention and action, which we must, we can only do so if we are honest about our failures. We will not be able to carry the public with us if we try to pretend that everything we've done over the last 15 years has been absolutely perfect. It's all gone swimmingly, it's not our fault, it's the fault of someone else, it's the fault of the United States, or it's the fault of the local government. Britain has no lessons to learn. If we take that attitude, we will not be able to carry the public with us. But we conclude with what we can do. We can address these threats. We showed for 60 years that NATO knows how to contain the kind of threat posed by Putin. We've proved it again and again, year in, year out, and it is the greatest achievement of our civilization. That peace in Europe, we did it before, we can do it again. We showed, and my honourable and gallant friend from Beckenham showed in Bosnia, that we know how to do humanitarian intervention. We proved it clearly. And we can do that again. Maybe not on the scale of Syria, but that isn't a reason for despair. And finally, we've shown in counterterrorism for the last 12 years that we have effectively prevented a repeat of a 9/11 style attack on the homelands of the United States or Europe, and we did so without winning the counterinsurgency campaigns, creating rule of law, creating governance, or nation building under fire. As we go into the NATO summit, those lessons from the Defence Committee over the last 10 years need to be taken forward. Investment in strategic thought, focus on what we have got wrong, focus on what we can still do, and absolute leadership in NATO on the subject of the 2% spending. Leadership essential to protect ourselves, leadership essential to encourage other NATO countries to meet their obligations, but above all, a commitment to that level in order to show Russia that we are not bending, we're not moving away, but we are determined to keep that 60 years of hard-won peace. If we can get that right, if we can connect strategic thinking to defence spending, we can make this NATO summit in Wales a chance to say, finally, that Britain understands that if we cannot always do what we pretend, we can do much, much more than we fear.